Okay,
They think you're a hippie.
I'm giving you an
They
announcement.
do.
We prayed before I turned the camera on. Okay? I just want to make sure that's clear. All right. We're going to deal with the pastoral letters today. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. They're called pastoral because they're letters to individuals and they deal with the structure and behavior of churches. So they are pastoral in text. And they're also in an environment which there's no longer missionary expansion. They're talking about the care of evangelized communities, communities that already have a church set up. They deal with internal life of the church, governance, behavior of the church, and there's no relationship between 1st and 2nd Timothy. On the other hand, 1st Timothy and Titus are very similar. And in fact, some of the wording, the vocabulary is the same. 4 views on authorship. This comes to bear when we deal with some of what's in the text. The first is it's written by Paul. It says it's from Paul. It's in with the Pauline letters. It's always been considered to be by Paul, and so it is commonly accepted as written by Paul. Scholars have 3 different views. The first view is that it was written by a disciple of Paul after his death, and there are several reasons for that. The literary, historical, and theological differences between the 7 letters that everybody concurs were written by Paul and this are different. We have righteousness to be lived here rather than righteousness in relationship to God. Paul clearly has an assumed apostleship here rather than one that has to be defended elsewhere. He confronts false teachers versus false doctrine in this set of books. And he assumes faith in doctrine rather than faith in God as such. And so there's a slight difference here. In fact, when we get into one, he talks about the faith rather than having faith. And that's a little bit different implication of the use of the word. They share a common Greek vocabulary, which is different from the others. And I picked 4 words. I'm going to give you the English translation of the words rather than the Greek. Epiphany, Savior, piety, and the faith versus faith. Those words don't appear elsewhere in Paul's letters, but they appear several times in these letters. It also presumes a institutional church system, organization, that we don't find in the early letters. In the early letters, he was talking about church, house churches, and small groups that gathered together. And here we're talking about a more finitely structured church. And we'll talk about that when we get into the details of them. There seems to be an internal difference between faith and the practice of faith. There's a new emphasis on adherence to tradition and regulation, which we don't see in the early letters. It appears to advocate a peaceful coexistence with the Greco-Roman community that it coexists with. We find several places in the letters where he says we have to do this because we want to set the model so that the community sees us and likes the kinds of people we are. Although 2 Timothy is different from 1 Timothy, only 1 Timothy and Titus deal with the actual pastoral ideas, guidance of the church, organization of the church. And the itinerary, which these 3 books are based on, the one they describe, is different from the itinerary that Paul describes and that Acts describes. And we know that Paul and Acts differ, but the itinerary described in these letters is different from both of them. And so there's some, why is that? The third view of this is that 1 Timothy and Titus were pseudo-epigraphical, but 2 Timothy, which seems to be his last will, his last testament, was written by Paul. That's a third view. The fourth view, not widely held, is that these letters were composed of fragments of other letters, and documents that Paul had written and somebody later on had put together into these 3 letters. That's not widely held. The most widely held is number 2, pseudepigraphical. Yes, ma'am.
Pseudepigraphical.
That means written, call it written in the style of Paul, using Paul's theology, and not trying to forge his writing, but writing for him. And we see in Greek writings and writings during this period of time was common in philosophy circles that a student would write something and sign the philosopher's name to it because it's all part of their philosophy. And so that's what pseudepigraphical means, and that's how it's used. But regardless of who wrote it and when it was written, or when they were written, there are 3 impacts on Christianity that make these letters important. The first, they established the classic church organization with presbyters, deacons, and bishops, missing from the house churches. Secondly, it establishes the importance of doctrine, faithful teaching, right teaching. This is an emphasis we don't see in the earlier letters. And finally, it establishes Paul as the penultimate or as the ultimate apostle. His theories, his theology that he puts, and his organization of the church makes him a key piece of the church as it goes forward, certainly on a par with Peter. I mean, once you get beyond the first century, the 2 apostles they talk about consistently are Peter and Paul. John, to a lesser extent, there's a big argument over whether the Gospel of John was written and should be in the canon or not. But there was never any doubt that the letters of Paul should be in there, and anything with Peter's name on it should be in the canon. So these 3 principles make the letters that we're looking at here important for Christianity. There's some common thoughts that run through this. There's an inseparability between belief and practice. There's a requirement for the integrity of the church leadership. They have to be models. They have to be examples in the community. They have a stress on holding to the fundamental convictions of the gospel in the face of alternative teaching. You have to fit into the Greco-Roman environment. All of the letters have something to say about getting along with your neighbors in the Greco-Roman environment. And it stratified church behavior for men and women. And this is, of course, the most contentious issue raised in these letters. And we'll talk about that. And as usual, all is not what it appears to be often. So I was going to start with 2 Timothy because the third view of this says Timothy should be first because it's the real one. But I'm going to take it sequentially and go 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus. 1 Timothy was written, if it was written by Paul, about 65, right close to the time when he died, most likely by a disciple. I mean, if it wasn't by Paul, it was most likely by a disciple toward the end of the first century, sometime between 85 and 90, thereabouts. And it was possibly written to bring the written instructions of Paul closer into the harmony with the structure and belief that had developed by that time. And remember, that's after the Gospels have been written and after Paul's journeys. It was written to Ephesus from Lystra. Lystra had been evangelized already in 49 or 46, and it was written to Timothy. Now, we know we've run into Timothy. Timothy traveled with Paul. Acts cites a family background of Timothy who had a Jewish mother and a Gentile father, and he had actually been circumcised to curtail Jewish anger because he'd come from a Jewish mother and hadn't been circumcised, so Paul asked him to be circumcised. That's in Acts, so we have that background. And in fact, one of the letters, Paul refers to that family history. Consistently, he's mentioned lovingly and appreciatively in all the letters. He alternates between addressing Timothy and addressing the community. False teachers are named in some cases, but as usual, whatever false teaching there is hinted at. He very seldom makes a specific thing and says, they say this and I say that. He cautions about some aspects of the false teachings, and we'll see that. He says how important it is to know how to behave in the household of God. That's an interesting phrase because the household of God is how Israel looked at itself. And so it's a very Jewish phrase that he's talking about how to behave within the household of God. It starts with an address. It's pretty much routine address that we see in all of his letters. But there's no Thanksgiving section. You remember, you normally started with an address, and then there's a Thanksgiving section before he gets into the body. There's no real Thanksgiving section here, although he does state clearly that he has been commissioned by God, and his instructions carry the weight of that. He starts right in with a warning against false teaching. Don't teach a different doctrine. And different doctrine he typifies. He says people are talking about myths and genealogies and speculations. Don't deal with that. Meaningless talk. And this is a subject that comes up in all three letters about defending against meaningless talk and chatter, idle chatter. And those who desire to teach the law. Now, this clearly is in reference to the Jewish community. And he does this again later on in the letters. He talks about those who emphasize circumcision. So that's still around. He talks about his own experience in following Christ. And this is typical of some of his letters where he talks about the suffering that he's gone through and what he's gone through to be giving the gospel of Christ. And he gives a charge to Timothy to follow the instructions that he's given to Timothy to preach the gospel. And a phrase he uses several times. I like it. Fight the good fight. And we see that in our own lives, fighting the good fight when it comes to Christianity. We have an ordering of public worship, how you should behave in worship rather than the sequence of the hymn and the Apostles' Creed. And those. It's more like how you should behave in the church with a household code. You need to be quiet and dignified. We would expect that. He talks here about accommodating to the community, to put an example of peace and harmony in front of the community so that you don't disturb the community and rile them up against you. And clearly, that's an experience Paul has had, having been run out of several towns because they riled up the community. And so he's giving that guidance here, that he should be careful to do that. This is where it gets unpopular in modern day parlance. It is disproportionately corrective of women. He justifies this by saying God created Adam first, then he created Eve, conveniently skipping the whole first chapter of Genesis, where God created man, male and female, created he them, with no sequence involved. But he chastises women to behave and dress modestly, warns them against wearing flamboyant clothing and jewelry and hairstyles. Now, there's some reason here for this, I think. We'll get there. The part he says, no teaching, no authority over men, and be quiet in service. Now, clearly, these are not Methodist doctrines. Now, I will say this, too, as an aside. When I took the New Testament, the professor I had, which I dearly loved, had gone with her husband to Dallas Seminary, Baptist Seminary. And on the first day of class, the professor took roll, and he got to the two of them, the same names. He says, are you two related? I said, yeah, we're married. And he turns to her and he says, okay, when you go home, talk to your husband. He will explain all this stuff to you. That's why she's a Methodist. And she's a professor in a Methodist theological seminary. But that is a piece that is still part of many religions. But there's a possibility here that we don't really see. and that's later on in the letters, he cautions about having foolish people come into households and talk to silly women. So if you step back for a minute and say, if that's the case, then perhaps these false teachers are coming into the women who are at home and not otherwise occupied and filling their heads full of these false teachings. And then in church service, they're raising those issues. I don't know that's true, but it's a possibility. One reason to perhaps explain that. But that sticks with us, and it's in Titus also. It doesn't go away. And we touched on that in Ephesians and Colossians as well.
What about the thing about the rich women who would make a lot of noise?
Well, that's what I was talking about here. The same concept that these people...
But the ones you're talking about that are at home, that
they're the
sounds
rich
like
women.
Naive,
No,
young women
well,
who don't
he uses
know.
the term silly women.
So that, to me, means naive and young, not rich and old and wearing a lot of braided hair.
Well, the whole
and
issue
whatnot.
about dressing modestly and not wearing a lot of jewelry and all, and people coming into the houses, implies that these are well-off women.
So they would not be really young and, quote, silly. Silly's the wrong word. But
Well, I'll take that up with Paul when I see him.
don't you think silly's the wrong word?
Oh, he gets worse. He gets some guidance. He gets some guidance in Titus that I'll read you. I think it's
We had a woman walk
pretty
out
funny.
on this.
We did. We're in a Bible study, and
With
we got to
Bob
Paul.
Crawford.
She just, that's it. I don't
She
want
said,
to
I'm
do it.
done. I hate Paul. Anyway, go ahead.
But he goes on to give instructions to the church leaders. And this is where we get to bishops, presbyters, and deacons. All bishops were presbyters. Presbyter is the Greek word for elders. All bishops are presbyters. And then there are deacons. And the deacons are not necessarily presbyters, but they could technically become presbyters, I guess, basing on their age. You remember in Acts, you haven't gotten to Acts yet, but I'm sure you've all read them, when there is a discussion with Philip, actually, in Jerusalem about the allocation of food to the Aramaic speakers and the Greek speakers. And the solution to that is to establish 7 deacons to serve the food. And that the word, the Greek word that's based on is server, is what it comes from. And so they had established deacons at a lower level, but with the same kinds of criteria. Married only once, be ethical, and in the case of deacons, they need to be tested. Now that implies youth.
Could be.
They could, and women could be deacons, and he cites women as deacons. But again, that's to the server implication of that, rather than the teaching, preaching part of that. That fits in here, whether we like it or not. But because they had to be tested, that's an implication that they were young and that they had to be qualified in order to do that. And they could apparently move up as they proved themselves and got older. And we see this structure again in Titus, and we see it in the early church, composed of each town had a bishop, and they were popularly elected. Another one of my favorite stories from church history is the town of Rimini on the Adriatic coast of Italy. Had a horrible bishop, and they ousted him. And they had a mayor they loved. And so the town got together and elected the mayor bishop, skipping the fact that he wasn't an ordained Catholic priest. And so the Pope had to make special arrangements to get this guy through all the ordination process in a hurry so he could be the bishop, the town bishop. So we get that structure is going to be with the church for a long time in the future as it's established here. He goes back to false teaching, and he says there are 2 paths of false teaching. There is one with a Jewish background and a teachers of the law. Now this implies we may be getting back to the synchronistic piece where it ties visions and asceticism together with that. He again cites dedication to myths and genealogies. Now, some scholars see this as the beginning of Gnosticism. And I'm not going to go into Gnosticism. It's so complicated, a theological structure, it'll make your head spin. But it implies myths and genealogies as part of that. And so there are scholars who think that this is early Gnosticism, although most scholars say that's something that developed in the second century, not this early. And they're interested in making money. There are a couple of things he keeps saying. I talked about idle chatter. Making money comes in back and forth when he's challenging these false teachers. And we've seen that in other Paul's letters where he says, I do this and I support myself. I don't depend on you for your money. And so that's another criteria he uses here. But he encourages Timothy to take the right path, preaching the correct gospel and to counter the false teaching. And so we've got another analogy almost to that 2 stages, light, darkness, walk in the world, walk spiritually. You have 2 paths. You've got the path of false teaching and you've got the path of doctrine or correct teaching. He takes his time and he talks about widows. This is the first time we've really seen him go into detail about widows. And there are 2 kinds of widows. There are the widows of men who have died. And there are special widows who are over 60 and they pray ceaselessly and they serve in the church. Now, he doesn't call them deacons. Deacons serve. But he makes a special deal out of these special widows who have been widowed once and have grown children and are constantly praying and providing service to the church. But then he steps back and he is hostile to widows who have children and grandchildren who are not supporting them and they're not taking care of them. I don't know what kind of widows were leaving their children and grandchildren to make it on their own, but apparently there were some. And he didn't want the community to support those widows whose children and grandchildren should be supporting them. It should make us all feel good that we should expect our children and grandchildren to support us as we get old, if that's an appropriate situation. Again, he comes back to elders and the presbyters are worthy of double honor, which means there's a real respect for the elderly, whether they have a role in the church or not. So we're looking at the older widows, we're looking at the older men, and we acknowledge and respect their wisdom. I like that idea. I really do. I see we don't get enough of that in society today. He also laid out procedures for dealing with bad elders. So apparently there were some. And he adds to slaves, be submissive. Now, the difference between some of these codes and the ones we saw in Ephesians and Colossians is he treated both sides of the spectrum. He said, masters, be respectful. He said, slaves, be obedient. He said, sons do this, fathers do that. Wives do this, husbands do that. We don't get the husband-wife thing here, but we definitely only get one side of the slave issue. Be submissive. And we'll see that in Titus as well. It almost echoes the same words. And he ends with 2 things. First, warning against false teaching, a doctrine of godless attributes. And he lists those kinds of things that are godless attributes of the false teachers. And he condemns them again for the pursuit of money. Paul's very clearly against preaching for money. I guess we ought to make that point to Reggie. He and Pia and Lauren should be preaching for free, but I don't think that's going to work. It's probably up to the SPRC.
Well, I think they do preach for free. It's all the other work that they do.
That's correct. He finishes with a charge to Timothy, again with fight the good fight. I think that's a classic line. Keep the commandments without spot or blame. Guard what has been entrusted to you and preach the right gospel. And so again, we have this push of doctrine here, the right gospel. Not just anything, but the right gospel. And there's a concluding blessing, as he always has in all his letters. What do we get out of this? Well, the church must order its worship. It's got doctrine, and it's got to order its life in the community in accordance with Paul's teaching, his preached gospel. Sound doctrine is concerned with spiritual transformation and ethical conduct, not speculation and dreaming. Teaching tied to Jewish law and genealogies and myths is unfounded and should be rejected entirely. Church leaders are servants of the people and models of behavior. And unfortunately, women must not teach or preach and must be silent in church. That's kind of what that letter says.
This is one.
This is Timothy 1, right?
When did the young widows come on?
Oh, he was in here. That was the widows who...
No, young widows should remarry and have
Oh,
children.
I get to that. I get to that.
I don't know, what was that? How young can I be?
Questions on 1 Timothy? It's first because it's the longest. And that's why Timothy is numbered 1 and 2, is because Timothy came first and 2 Timothy came second. But there's no relationship between the two. They're not similar letters at all.
Is it to the same Timothy?
Yeah, it's to the same Timothy.
Okay.
But this Timothy, 2 Timothy, is being written as Paul is facing certain death. And we don't get that here. We don't get that in 1 Timothy at all. We look at if it was written by Paul around 60 AD, and if it was pseudo-epigraphical, it was written toward the end of the century. There are some who push it later than that, but most don't. Most people who don't attribute it to Paul push it toward the end of the first century on it. I said there's no ties to first. He cites a number of people which validate that he at least has a familiarity. If it is written by someone else, he has a familiarity with Paul's letters and Paul. But its itinerary and what he says does not track with Paul's itinerary. Remember Paul in Romans, you don't remember that, although I'm sure you've read Romans. He says, I'm writing to you because I'm planning on coming to you for support for my mission to Spain. That's what he says in Romans. Acts says Paul was going to go to Rome and then go to Spain. And in all these letters, we have Paul going to Rome from Caesarea under imprisonment, being tried, released, going back to the Aegean communities, then coming back to Rome and be imprisoned again. And there's no other writing or documentation that confirms that. And so it appears to be a way to say, well, these letters are by Paul because he actually did this, even though nobody wrote anything about it. So its track doesn't follow. It's not from any of his travels. But it's clear that Paul is near death, and he's alone. And he's handing his mission on to Timothy to continue preaching the gospel and continue what Paul has started. He's forsaken by friends. He's imprisoned for the gospel, but powered by the Lord to endure the sufferings and to celebrate it. It's kind of an end-of-life testimony from Paul. And that's why one group of scholars think Timothy is actually by Paul and was written toward the end of his life, whether it was written under this first documented Roman imprisonment or a hypothetical second Roman imprisonment. It would appear that it was being written by that because it is so I want to say full of empathy and ruing of that situation. It opens with an address and a greeting. It cites Timothy in his background. I cited Timothy's background I talked about Acts and 1 Timothy. Paul refreshes it and talks about his background here. He has a thanksgiving, which is closer than to what we saw in the first 7 letters. Then, of course, 1 Timothy skipped the thanksgiving entirely. And it's clear that this is a personal letter to Timothy. It is guidance for Timothy. It's encouragement for Timothy from an imprisoned Paul facing imminent death. He cites their co-suffering rather than shame for the gospel. And he said this before. every one of the imprisoned letters, we say he is in prison, but he's continuing to preach the gospel. He's not showing shame for being in prison. He is proud to be in prison for the gospel. Hold to the standard of sound doctrine. It's a new concept for these pastoral letters, is an affirmed, fixed gospel that could only have grown out of earlier Pauline letters and preaching. Again, for the gospel, I was appointed an apostle, a herald, and a teacher. And he puts his trust here in Timothy to continue to preach the revealed gospel. And it clearly thinks he's been abandoned by all in Asia. He gives some instructions for preaching to Timothy. Suffer for the gospel. He uses 3 professions as an example. Like a soldier, you have to be prepared for and accept suffering in the service in the battle for the gospel. Like an athlete, you have to follow the rules, follow the doctrine. And like a farmer, you will reap the first fruits. And we've seen him talk about the first fruits of resurrection earlier in his letters. All called to a faithful endurance in the face of opposition to the gospel. He gives some guidance on true teaching. Avoid wrangling over words. Remember, we went back and he said it before. Idle chatter, idle talk. Avoid wrangling over words. Avoid profane chatter and senseless conversation. That's good advice for anybody, I guess. But that's what he's giving to Timothy. And it's clear that this has been part of the false teaching pieces that he's seen. He does cite 2 men who had abandoned him, and that he had abandoned because they were preaching and already received resurrection. And we saw that in earlier letters, where there's some who were saying the resurrection has already happened. And he's condemning that thought. He says, become like utensils, useful and dedicated. Shun youthful passions. That's an interesting piece he comes through with this on that. He says at the end of days, there will be dangerous times. We're going to have lovers of themselves and money again, ungrateful to the Lord. They will make their way into households and convince silly women of the wrong doctrines. Well, it's that same concept I think we saw in saying women should be silent. I don't know, it may not be true. And then he cites the 2 Egyptian priests that faced Moses as exemplars of false doctrine that need to be overcome. They preached a doctrine of Pharaohism, whereas Moses was preaching the gospel of the Lord. And so he says we need to watch out for those people. As a final encouragement to Paul, he talks about his own troubles and tribulations. This is not uncommon in his letters. Continue in what you learn. And this is another part that I really like, but is misused. All scripture is useful for teaching, reproof, for correction, and training in righteousness. What we often overlook is that Paul's talking about the Old Testament. That's the only scripture he had available to him. Now, clearly, in Latter-day Christians, we have taken that piece of guidance and made it apply to the entire scriptural package that became the Christian scriptures around 340 AD. But it's a very nice piece. Proclaim the message. Again, he's giving guidance to Timothy on his way out the door. Be sober, endure suffering, spread the gospel, and perform your mission faithfully. The time will come when people will not follow sound doctrine. Goes back to the end of times issue. And then I love this phrase. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. That is an absolutely incredible phrase. If I had an epitaph, that would be the epitaph that I would love to have. So whether he wrote it or not, it's incredibly good. Then there's a practical guidance about to come and bring his coat and do all of these things, which is kind of odd. And for a man who's getting ready to be killed, bring my coat that I left in Troas. And concluding greetings and a benediction. We get out of this grace given to us from Jesus Christ, who abolished death and brought light and immortality through the gospel. A need for virtue and good instruction for the benefit of the community and its reputation. And, as usual in these letters, avoid false teachers. I particularly like the silly women comment.
I don't translate from the Greek. Is that the word?
It is. You want me to look it up when we're finished? I'll do that.
That's just a ludicrous word to use.
I will look it up when we're finished. You should have raised that at home. I would have had it already looked up. Or I can give you the Bible and you can look it up. All right, the last letter is Titus. Titus duplicates a lot of the things that we saw in 1 Timothy. If it was by Paul around 65 AD, if it was pseudo-epigraphical around the end of the first century, around the same date as 1 Timothy. And again, the timeline is off from Acts and Paul's guidance. This letter is to Timothy in Crete. There's nothing in any of the other documents that imply that Paul went to Crete. But it implies here that he'd been to Crete and set up the church there. We know that Paul has used Titus as a messenger. 1 and 2 Corinthians, he was going back and forth cited in the letters. And he was used as an uncircumcised Gentile as an example when Paul went to Jerusalem, to show that an uncircumcised Gentile could be a follower of Christ. And so he's been used before in conjunction with Paul. As I said, it assumes that Paul had been in Crete, very similar to 1 Timothy. And it appears to be a commissioning letter because he gives guidance to Titus to set things up. It's like when we commission a group of people to go out to do something, we give them instructions, and it's kind of the mood of this letter, is a commissioning letter to Titus. It includes the Pauline vision of faith, hope, and love, which we've seen before. And the dominant theme is church structure. Clearly, Paul hasn't set it up this way, but he's expecting Titus to set it up this way. We have an opening, an address to Titus, and a greeting, and the sight that God promises eternal life. The church structure and appointment of presbyters and bishops and deacons is in parallel with what we saw in 1 Timothy. And it's clear, Paul didn't appoint them before, but now he wants Titus to appoint them because it needs to be done. And it lists the same characteristics of bishops and deacons and presbyters as we saw in 1 Timothy. Models to the community, quiet, married only once, loving, dedicated. His false teaching points here, again, silence the rebellions. They're upsetting families. So apparently there is a rebellion in Crete against the gospel. We don't know exactly what that is. He has an interesting comment. He says, Cretans are liars. It's probably as direct a castigation of a community as we found in Galatians when he was really mad at them. But again, as an aside, at this point, it was a common myth or common condemnation of Crete in the Aegean, that they were Cretans and less than intelligent. Even as we saw that Corinth had a reputation for being a profligate, licentious community, Crete had a reputation of being substandard in their intelligence. But there are Jewish myths and corruptions. Again, perhaps mysticism or this syncretic behavior we talked about before with Greek philosophy and Judaism being combined. And he talks specifically about circumcisers. So clearly there's a Jewish link to whatever false teaching is going on. Then we get to the household chores. They're very similar. Teach sound doctrine. Gives guidance to old men in behavior. It's just what you would expect. Guidance to older women. This is my favorite one. Not to be slanderers or slaves to drink. Isn't that good guidance for older women?
No,
How about the
alcoholics.
That's right. No slanderers or slaves to drink.
What was the guidance to old men?
Be nice. I mean, the guidance to older men was what you would expect about being models for the community and all that, without telling them not to slander and not to drink.
Old
Because he
drunks.
figured there was no point.
Probably.
Maybe.
It won't matter what I say.
They're going to do what they want to do.
Older women should teach younger women. That's a clear.
Not to drink and slang.
Guidance to young men to be self-controlled. Guidance to slaves, be submissive and honest this time. Be a model of good works and integrity. And young widows should get married again. Now, you remember early Paul? Women who are, if you're not married, don't get married. If you're married, get married. Stay married, because the Parousia is coming next Tuesday. Well, it's clear that by now we've come to grips with the fact that that's not going to happen immediately, and that we need to set up a process and a community.
And I think one of the things about that maybe is because women generally didn't take care of themselves, didn't have money on their own, young ones had the possibility of marriage and having
That's correct.
children. And that way the community didn't have to take care of them.
That's
They were
correct.
taken care of
That's
by
a
the
good
new
point.
husband.
That's a good point.
Yes.
A woman's value and life structure in the community was based on being somebody's wife or daughter or even sister. We don't follow that guidance here, but that's true. Before Christ, we were foolish and disobedient, slaves to passions. Christ gave himself to redeem us, not because of the works of righteousness, but because of his grace. Remember this works of righteousness. In the earlier letters, he's talking about righteousness as a behavior rather than a relationship to God. In early letters, righteousness is your relationship to God, righteousness and being justified to God. Here he's talking about works of righteousness. Be models to attract others. Quarrels can disrupt our relationship with the community. Again, that issue of being stable in the community and not causing differences between us and the community. And then a conclusion and greetings and blessings. The summary of that is churches and leaders must live in accordance with the gospel. The need for virtue and good instruction for the good of the community and for the community's reputation. Turn away from false leaders, and a need for qualified church leaders. So those are the pastoral letters. So what does he want out of all of that? When you listen to all of that and you read them, what do you walk away saying, this is what Paul is aiming for?
Trying to set up the church structure so that when he leaves, things are carried out in a
That's true.
logical manner.
Give it a structure to live. Stability, an internal harmony. Remember, in his early letters, we talked about unity a lot. And he wanted an internal harmony of the church where they could get along and progress. Cling to doctrine. Stay away from false teaching, of which there seems to have been a myriad going on. And he's clearly got his eye on a future church. We saw his theology change from the house church to the church as an institution in Colossians and Ephesians. Remember, in Colossians and Ephesians, he's talking about the church with Christ as its head, rather than in the earlier letters, he's talking about house churches, people worshiping and staying in harmony with each other. So we've seen that transition here as well. He's clearly looking for the future and how the church is going to survive and what it means to be a good church member and church leader and to be a child of Christ. Other questions? Wow, Gene hasn't had a question.
Well, the thing that puzzled me often as I read Paul's letter that read to Acts,
Right.
is that I never really did see what the Roman power structure had against him. I mean, he was teaching people to be good members of the community. And he wasn't teaching rebellion. Give up to Caesar those things that belong to Caesar.
That's Jesus.
And also I had the feeling that he could have escaped the judgment of Caesar. You remember in Acts where before he's put on a ship to Rome, the senior Roman official in Caesarea,
Festus, my favorite Roman name.
holds has a hearing.
Yep.
And when the hearing is over, he turns to the whichever Herod it was
Right.
that was in power at that point. If this guy had, speaking of Paul, he said, if this guy had appealed to Caesar,
right. He says that.
we would have
right.
no grounds for
Right.
Right.
He's done nothing against the Roman Empire.
That's right. And I can't see where he did anything against the Roman Empire anywhere along the way.
It's all perception. Remember, he is preaching a gospel that does not worship the emperor.
So that's true.
And remember when I said earlier that if you're not worshiping the right gods, you're putting the community at risk.
Right.
And so Christians are not worshiping the right God. Even though in later times they pray for the emperor, they don't pray to the emperor. And so that's a point of contention. And he managed to stir up local merchants. Remember the silver merchants that were making little tiny models, idols, and Paul has talked people into not buying them. And so they're all upset and they run him out of town because they're ruining his business. I mean,
it's described in Acts.
It's described in detail in Acts, but the actual incident is referred to in Paul's letters. He goes into Thessalonica and he convinces the slave girl who is prophesying the future. He does an exorcism and she doesn't prophesy anymore. And the people who were making money out of it and believing it got mad and threw him out of Thessalonica. So Paul had the ability to irritate the pagan community, whether he was trying to rile them up or not. But the things that he did and the beliefs, of the commitment to a single God, not the Roman gods, was disruptive by and of itself. And so there was that to it.
And so the success of Christianity after Paul may be credited to the fact that a fair number of the rulers became converts.
Some did. It's hard to say how many, but certainly the Caesars didn't, because although we don't see it in Paul, by the time we get to the end of the first century and into the second century, we are seeing serious martyrdom issues. We're seeing people burned at the stake, fed to live animals. but much worse than fed to dead animals, I guess.
Mhm.
But we're seeing people fed to the wild beasts. We're seeing some serious assaults on Christianity, which really didn't completely disappear until Constantine. I mean, it came and went. I mean, some emperors were worse than others. But that came and it hit hard on the Christian community. And it split the Christian community. There was a period, I want to say, Tertullian was writing, so the end of the first century, when they had one of these pogroms, and you had to sacrifice to Caesar in front of the court in order to stay alive. If you didn't do that, you would be condemned. There were a number of people who did, who backed off, who gave up Christianity to sacrifice to stay alive. Well, when that was over, those who didn't, who had fled and had managed to survive, didn't want to admit those people who had done that pro-temporary sacrifice back into the church. So, I mean, it split the church open on that. So that kind of thing was serious. Does that help?
Yeah.
But Paul was not a revolutionary. I mean, he except religiously.
Right.
He talks in these letters about get along with the community, try to stay in touch with the community, and set a model for them. And in fact, other scholars have written how in early Christianity it was the behavior of the Christians that attracted some of the pagans to Christianity. They saw how they cared for each other and how they loved each other, and that appealed to some that wanted them to come to Christianity.
Yeah, well, there's a large amount of history, church history, which is not covered in the Bible.
Well, that's a fact. That's a fact. I took a whole course on church history that starts with that and goes forward, and we get heresy. I'm not naming names. We had a associate pastor who said Christianity was a steady, straight stream until we got to the Reformation, and that's not true. Early Christianity was hugely varied. Everybody had an idea, and they all tracked their own version of Christianity. And it wasn't probably till Constantine he forced it to neck down to one or two versions. And then it was one version until we got, well, it wasn't, because we split the Eastern Church off from the Western Church, and we had the Aramaic Church, and we had the Ethiopian Church. These were all different groups that differed on Scripture, differed on ritual. One of my favorite arguments is, and this was between the East Church and the West Church, whether Jesus and God are of the same substance or similar substance. That was an excommunication issue. So church history is a whole different issue. And Paul is just a very footnote here of church history. But it set the church on the path that we see. Some people call it early Catholicism, and that's not true. It was an early church structure that developed and has nothing to do with Catholicism, except in terms of the use of the word Catholic as universal, because we're getting a universal church structure embedded here. And I'm not sure that went anywhere initially beyond what the churches that Paul had founded. I don't know what would have happened elsewhere, but it did catch on. Other questions?
We have the expert here, Paul. He can speak for himself.
Wrong, Paul.
Wrong, Paul.
I have his letters from the IRS. Okay, then let's bow our heads. We don't have a Stephen minister, so Karen, you want to close us out in prayer?
Am I the Stephen? You're just calling on me. Thank you, God, for bringing us all together safely to hear your word, to study your word, to decipher some of what the Bible means to us today. Be with all of us as we go our separate ways and bring us back safely again next week to study again. Amen.
Amen. Next week is Romans, and Romans is the most theological dense
So bring your
book.
I'm for sure sitting by the door next week.
Gets too heavy, you're booking. Gail,
You
watch.
don't say about
I'll give you
being
right
on
on
the
the
street.